Members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? The member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This week marks International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and 16 days of activism to help prevent and eliminate violence against women and girls. Family violence occurs across all social groups. It does not respect class, education or social status. Women and children are most commonly its victims. It often goes unreported. Physical violence is its most visible form, but other forms of violence and abuse can be equally harmful. These issues are intergenerational and they hurt us all. In the year ending...
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
call the member for Kooyong in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In the year ending March 2024, over 1,000 family violence incidents were reported in the city of Burundara, the largest local government area in Kooyong. Half of those involved violence between partners and a third were witnessed by children. I thank the staff of the organisations who support women and children affected by family violence in Kooyong. They include 1800-RESPECT, White Ribbon, the South Eastern Centre Against Sexual Assault, Eastern Community Legal Centre, Jura, Orange Door, the Women's Legal Service Victoria and the Rainbow Door. I also thank the first responders called out to deal with family violence, the police and ambulance who see people at their worst and deal with them with compassion and respect. Your work can be heartbreaking and I hope you know how much it is appreciated by our community. In recent months, the federal government has invested $4 billion into violence against women and another $4 billion into legal services. It's a good start, but it's just a start. We still need a significant uplift in frontline services to support girls and women fleeing domestic violence. The first step in that process has to be housing support. In Australia, last night, 7,500 women and children were couch surfing. 2,500 slept in their cars or they slept rough. We know that almost half the women and girls who are seeking homelessness assistance do so because of family and domestic violence. We know that lack of access to safe housing prevents many women from escaping violence. It pushes them back into violent homes. Deputy Speaker, at what could well be the end of this parliamentary term, we are still waiting the government's overdue National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. We need it urgently, and it needs to include increased support for the homeless, more investment in safe at-home programs, an increase in youth allowance payments and Commonwealth rental assistance, and more social housing. All of us here need to do what we can to keep women and children safer in this community.
And I call the member for Barton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We are blessed in my electorate, Barton, to have a cohort of fantastic teachers. I've been taking time to congratulate our longest-serving teachers for their devotion to their work and creating a bright future for students in their care. I was pleased to be able to present awards to long service in person at Danebank, Hurstville. Some teachers have been there for over 37 years, and the smart, strong young women I meet are a testament to their commitment. As we come to close another year, I know the joy of festive season is tempered by the ongoing conflict in Gaza and Lebanon. I continue to receive many emails and calls from constituents and have spoken to them in meetings. They express their collective grief, the horror of the sheer number of humanity lost and the desperate need for ceasefire. And they are aware of the realities of international politics and diplomacy, but call on their leaders to centre humanity. And Israel and Palestine as equal partners in the global stage. In this season of peace, joy and hope, may all the instruments for a more just and secure future for the world emerge. I wish Barton residents and everyone here a very happy festive season and a success and health in 2025.
I call the member for Longman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It was my honour to attend the Caboolture Seven-Day Adventist Church last Saturday, where they honoured two local organisations for their service to the Longman community for the third year running. This year, the recipients were the Caboolture Neighbourhood Centre, who work with a range of people in our community. One of the key programs is assisting people, particularly women, in assimilating into the Australian culture with practical courses on basic mechanics, like how to change a tyre, as many of these women have come from countries where women aren't even allowed to drive. And now they thankfully have this freedom that we simply take for granted. They also provide food hampers, run family fun days that are free for the community, run counselling services and courses such as financial resilience, basic computers, nutritional budget cooking, and anger control and behavioural change courses for adults. They also provide services in filling out forms, migration and visa advice. Well done to Malcolm, Marilyn and the entire team. The second recipient was Eat for the Streets, which was founded by Michael Cox, or Mick as we know him. They simply set up every Saturday at Centenary Lakes in Caboolture and make burgers, not only for the homeless but families struggling, where just not having to pay for one meal could be the difference between paying this week's rent or this week's mortgage payment. They have a no judgment policy, so they don't ask people's financial situation. They just provide food and a place to connect. Mick has also developed an app and website which people can use to see where other groups in the Longman community provide food during the week. Mick proudly stated that by using this resource, there is now at least one organisation providing a meal 7 days a week somewhere in our community, with the days, times and locations all provided on the Eats for the Streets website. The other outstanding attribute of Eats for the Streets is that to date they have been completely funded by the generosity of the local community, particularly the congregation at Emerge Church in Morayfield. Thank you to Pastor Casey Wolverton for inviting me to celebrate these two wonderful organisations. I'd also like to farewell the principal of Woodford Peter 10 State School, Ronnie Hill, and thank her for the 2 decades of service to the school and Woodford community. Ever since I met Ronnie, she has been advocating for Woodford State School to have grades 11 and 12 brought to the school so parents and students don't have the disruption of making the move to another school such as Kilcoy or Tallawong at a very important time in their education. Ironically, the LNP promised they would deliver this if elected, so Ronnie won't actually enjoy the fruits of her advocacy personally, but I know for Ronnie it was always about the students, not personal accolades. Well done, Ronnie, and we thank you.
I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it is with great pleasure that I inform the House that we are holding the second Central Coast Big Aussie Luncheon and Men's Health Forum in the Electorate of Robertson in early December, and the idea is to create a greater awareness of prostate cancer and men's health, particularly in men over the age of 40. And we're working in conjunction with multiple stakeholders and multiple partners to make sure that this event gets up off the ground. And what it will include is a lunch and presentations by representatives from the Prostate Cancer Foundation and myself, and all men over the age of 40 are welcome, and the list is growing as we speak. We actually held the inaugural Big Aussie Luncheon at the Davistown RSL last year, and that had close to 150 attendees. And a story that a constituent told me just recently was that the wife of one of the gentlemen that actually went to the last luncheons dragged her husband there. As we all know, men don't like going to the doctor. Dragged her husband there, and he thought, you know what, I'm going to get my prostate levels checked, my PSA checked. The prostate turned out to be okay, but he in fact actually had quite a significant tumour in his bladder, which wouldn't have been picked up if he didn't go to the doctor as a result of that. And he had surgery to resect that tumour, and ultimately that ended up saving his life. So, you know, we hold a lot of events as MPs, we hold a lot of forums and the like, but in this case, this was able to let this gentleman have access to the information that he needed. Then he went and saw a medical professional, and then ultimately that led to positive health outcomes for this gentleman. So I really encourage people to get in touch with my office if they'd like to attend this second Big Aussie Luncheon, because we are raising awareness for all men's health, but in particular prostate cancer. It's a condition that we need to make sure that we get on top of, both in the medical side of things, but also too as a parliament. We know that, you know, if we nip these things in the bud now, they don't exacerbate, they don't become metastatic disease and then require quite intensive chemoradiotherapy and surgery later on. So I would encourage people to get in contact with my office, and if you can't attend the Big Aussie Luncheon, then please get in touch with my office and we can send you some materials from the Prostate Cancer Foundation. We can send you some materials from the Federal Department of Health to make sure that you're informed and to make sure that you know all of the information that you need to know with regards to prostate cancer and other issues affecting men's health. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I call the member for Duroc.
Thank you. This week we mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, initiating the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. This global campaign compels us to confront the unacceptable reality. Violence against women and girls remains a pervasive issue in Australia, with over 60 women tragically losing their lives to domestic violence this year. In Durack, our regional and remote communities face particular challenges. The Kimberley region alone recorded 1,096 family assaults between July and September this year. These figures, quite simply, they're devastating, reflecting a crisis that is undermining the safety and cohesion of communities. Anecdotally, this is due to alcohol and drug abuse. Violence against women and girls is inexcusable. While it is a complex, multifaceted problem, it is not insurmountable. Today, we recommit to the goal of eliminating gender-based violence. This involves addressing its root causes, breaking cycles of violence and fostering a culture of respect and equality. However, women in regional, rural and remote areas like Durack, well, they face unique challenges. Women living on farms or in small towns often hesitate to seek help due to the lack of anonymity and also just that fear of gossip in tight-knit communities. Our sisters in cities, well, hopefully they have more privacy and are able to access a broader range of services. Regional women's needs differ significantly from those in metropolitan areas, and this requires tailored programs that address these specific barriers. One such program is the remarkable DV Assist. DV Assist provides women in regional and remote Western Australia with free, anonymous and confidential counselling through phone and online services. This service is simply a lifeline that ensures those who seek help can access the discreet support they need without fear of exposure or judgment. But of course, men and boys are vital partners in preventing violence. Engaging them in this mission is key. Of course it's key to breaking cycles of violence and transforming societal norms. Men are essential to the solution, and I strongly believe that there should be more focus on supporting programs that help our men to simply be better men. The Coalition demonstrated our commitment to women's safety with around $1 billion. This funding helps support women escaping violent relationships and strengthen frontline domestic and family violence services, but we need to do more. There are a lot of words spoken about keeping our women and our girls safe, but I think we all know in this place that words simply aren't enough. We need more action and we need it now. Let's commit to eliminating gender-based violence, no matter where our women are, no matter where they live.
I call the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to acknowledge Elizabeth Ann Gillespie, or Lizzie to her family and friends, a great South Australian who passed away last month. Born in 1942, the 13th child of 14, Elizabeth led a storied life. She had a rare genetic disorder, spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia congenita, or SEDC, which affects the bones of the spine, the arms and the legs. She wasn't expected to live a long life, but she surpassed every expectation, living until 82. SEDC often results in dwarfism and can cause really serious issues with vision and hearing loss as well. Lizzie chose not to have surgical interventions for scoliosis, and when she was asked if she ever regretted that choice, she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Well, I didn't have any guarantees I wouldn't be as I am today." Remembered as a really good student at St Dominic's Priory in North Adelaide, a classmate once noted that she faced every day with composure and courage, despite the difficulty and the discrimination that she would no doubt have faced as a student with disability back in the 1940s and 50s. In the 1960s, Elizabeth was an early leader and advocate for people with disability, a pioneering campaigner for disability rights, for acceptance and opportunity in South Australia. She and her sister would often write letters to people in positions of power to ask for better supports, for better services and for equal access. Lizzie was a lover of music. She was often said to be the last one standing on the dance floor, demanding that the band play one more song. In 1975, I'm pleased to say, Elizabeth continued her lifelong political activism when she joined the crowd of South Australians who protested the sacking of the Whitlam government in Victoria Square in the centre of Adelaide. In her later years, she lived a simple life. It was full of love, of kindness, of close friendship and of cats. She always had a great love of animals.
Sadly, Elizabeth passed away on the 6th of October 2024, and I want to provide my sincerest condolences to her family and to her friends. And I thank Lizzie for her advocacy, for her activism and her courage, supporting Australians with a disability, which has had an ongoing impact right until today.
I call the member for Wright.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's no secret that under an Albanese Labor government, Australians are worse off today than they were 3 years ago. We face an economy weighed down by Labor's severe mismanagement, and there doesn't seem to be a quick solution in sight. Australians are enduring the longest household recession on living record. Australia's costs are up, incomes are down, and families are struggling to make ends meet. Mortgage payments have tripled for many households due to 12 unnecessary rate rises under Labor's watch. Disposable incomes have collapsed by 8.7%, the largest fall since records began, and living standards have fallen off a cliff. And what's causing this pain? Well, it's Labor's undisciplined spending. By pumping $315 billion of wasteful programs, Labor is fueling inflation and driving grocery and energy prices higher for longer. Australians are now grappling with skyrocketing costs, electricity prices up over 30%, rents up 16%, and gas up a staggering 33%. Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank confirms that there's no sight of interest rates relief. Even worse, Labor is undermining key national institutions to try and cover up its failures. Their plan is to use the Future Fund as an independent sovereign wealth fund to secure Australia's financial future. It's reckless and it's unjustifiable. Redirecting the Future Fund's investments to pet projects not only threatens its independence, but also risks the prosperity of current and future generations, adding further evidence that when Labor run out of their own money, they'll come looking for yours. Labor never sought a mandate from the Australian people to make those changes, and when questioned in the Parliament, they had no answers. Labor's priorities are just all wrong. And instead of addressing the cost of living crisis, remember what they spent the $500 million on? A failed referendum showing their misdirected priorities. On nearly every metric, Australians are worse off. Labor productivity has fallen 6.3% in just 2 years. Household savings have collapsed, business insolvencies at record highs, GDP per capita, a measure that reflects what Australians truly feel, has gone backwards for 6 straight consecutive quarters, and it's a darn shame. It doesn't have to be this way. A Dutton-led coalition government will deliver a back-to-basic economic agenda. It'll fight inflation, cut red tape and secure our energy future. We'll reform taxes, support small businesses and restore Australia's living standards. The coalition's focus is clear. Restore economic discipline, rebuild productivity and get Australia back on track. Under our leadership, Australia can look forward to a bright and more prosperous future. My communities, my businesses, my farmers, my families, my pensioners are all struggling, and all Labor can offer them is a free TAFE course.
I call the member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This year marks a truly remarkable milestone for the I-98 FM Illawarra Convoy, as it celebrated 20 years of supporting local charities and families in need. Hosted by Marty, Christian and Bella from I-98 FM, the Illawarra Convoy is the largest truck and motorbike convoy in the Southern Hemisphere and one of the biggest single-day regional fundraisers in Australia. This year, Convoy raised an incredible $2.5 million, taking the overall total to just over $27.5 million over the past 2 decades. The money raised directly supports the Illawarra Community Foundation, which assists families across the Illawarra, Shoalhaven and Southern Highlands facing life-threatening or life-limiting illnesses. This year's convoy was truly historic, with a record-breaking 672 motorbikes, 715 trucks travelling the route from Appin Colliery to Shellharbour Airport. For the 4th consecutive year, Coles Illawarra had the winning bid of $220,000 for the lead bike. However, Peter Anderson, Regional Manager for Coles, offered the lead bike position to Chris from second place Throttle Jockeys, who has been facing his own cancer battle. The lead truck position for the Illawarra Convoy is one of the event's most prestigious and fiercely sought-after positions. This year, Carly and Adrian from Tiny Tins, together with Orlane from Wollongong Crane Trucks, demonstrated incredible dedication and teamwork to claim the coveted title. Their extraordinary bid of $300,020 secured the lead truck position, which they had narrowly missed out on last year. Carly, Adrian and Orlane didn't achieve this alone. With the support of James and Amy from Greshy's Boxing and Fitness, they worked tirelessly throughout the year, hosting events such as Battle of the Businesses Boxing Night. Their collaborative effort shows the incredible power of community, showing how local businesses and individuals can come together to achieve something truly remarkable. Tiny Tins also made the record books as they were the smallest truck to ever lead the convoy. This tiny truck was driven by 6-year-old Ace, who lives with Hirschsprung disease, which affects the colon and causes bowel issues. Ace and his family have been recipients of the incredible support that the Illawarra Convoy provide. It has been a dream of his to be the lead truck for Convoy, and thanks to the incredible efforts of Tiny Tins and Wollongong Crane Trucks, they were able to make this a reality. Ace drove the tiny truck out of the colliery to initially lead the convoy, but then jumped into the passenger seat as the tiny truck was put on the back of another truck to head down the mountain. Congratulations to Marty, Christian and Bella from I98 FM for another successful convoy, and congratulations to Ace for being the youngest to lead the convoy in the smallest truck.
I call the member for Deakin.
Well, thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday at the National Press Club, I made very clear to Australians that the Coalition, unlike the Labor government, won't accept a generation of Australians not having the same opportunities for home ownership that previous generations of Australians have enjoyed. We know, based on the track record of this government, that first home buyers are not a priority of this government. We know that not enough houses have been built, with falling completions, approvals and, of course, first home buyers. On every single metric, compared to the Coalition government, housing has gone backwards under the Albanese government. And meanwhile, whilst we're building fewer homes, while fewer homes are being completed and now fewer homes are being approved and there are less first home buyers, Labor has run the biggest migration program in a generation, with more than 1.4 million overseas arrivals and the government having absolutely no idea where those people will live. We've also made very clear that we understand that the deposit hurdle is just too high for so many people trying to break into the housing market. And so it begs the question as to why on earth the Labor Party would be trenchantly standing in the way of first home buyers getting access to a portion of their own money in superannuation to put towards that deposit to get into a new home, and then putting it back into their super at the end, ensuring their money is working for them to help them get into a new home. Under this government, access to finance has also become even harder, with a Big Four bank CEO stating publicly that if you're not wealthy, very difficult to get finance in this country, yet we've seen nothing from this government. And what do we see this week? We finally see the Labor Party prioritising foreign corporate landlords over Australian mums and dads owning Australian housing stock. We have the government now, in their alliance with the Greens, inviting foreign corporate funds, vulture funds, private equity to come into Australia with the most advantageous tax rates possible, the most advantageous tax rates, better than any Australian could get, in order to own tens of thousands of homes in this country. Well, the Coalition does not want the failed US corporate model here. We want Australians to own Australian homes. That's why this unholy alliance between the Greens and the Labor Party is leaving Australians behind, not to mention the fact that construction costs that are borne by first home buyers at the end have been exacerbated by the Labor Party buckling to the CFMEU, the criminal CFMEU, who's pushed up costs for first home buyers, who are ultimately the ones that wear those extra costs.
I call the member for Parramatta.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. And it's a privilege to stand here today and reflect on the remarkable contribution of Chinese Australians to our country. Contributions that have shaped not only our economy, but also the cultural richness and diversity that define modern Australia. From the earliest arrivals during the Gold Rush era to today's thriving Chinese communities, the impact of Chinese Australians can be seen in every corner of our society. They've also contributed to our nation's success in business, science, the arts and academia, as well as through their commitment to family, hard work and community. Their entrepreneurial spirit and resilience have made a lasting mark on our history. I was reminded of this just recently when I had the honour of hosting an event in Parramatta with the Chinese community and Australia's Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong. It was an inspiring gathering that celebrated the enduring relationship between Australia and China, as well as the immense contributions Chinese Australians make to our local community. Parramatta is the beating heart of multiculturalism in Western Sydney, and it's here that we see the strength of our diverse communities most clearly. The event was a powerful reminder that diversity is one of Australia's greatest strengths. The stories shared by community leaders and everyday Australians reflected the values that unite us all: respect, opportunity, and hope for a better future. As we heard from Senator Penny Wong herself, a symbol of Australia's diversity, the Chinese Australian community plays a crucial role in strengthening the ties between Australia and the broader Asia-Pacific region. Whether it's through fostering business relationships, excelling in education, or celebrating traditions like Lunar New Year that bring communities together, Chinese Australians are an integral part of our shared story. This contribution goes beyond economics or trade. It's cultural, personal, and deeply rooted in the belief that Australia is stronger when we embrace the richness of our multicultural heritage. It reminds us to celebrate our differences, honour our shared values, and commit to building a nation where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Chinese Australian community in Parramatta for their incredible contributions to our nation. Together, let us continue to champion a future that is inclusive, united, and full of promise to all Australians.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded, and I call the clerk.
Government business. Next order of the day, Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Amendment Scheduling Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Moreton.
Yeah.
I'll take that interjection. I rise in support of the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Amendment Scheduling Bill. I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and dedication of the former Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, who moved this matter forward, and the new Minister, the marvellous Minister McCarthy, who is progressing the legislative amendments. At the heart of this bill is Labor's recognition and ongoing support of the rights of First Nations people to own and control their traditional lands. That's at the heart of this whole piece of legislation. Recognising history, recognising truth, recognising facts. So this bill amends Schedule 1 of the Act and supports the finalisation of the land claim for approximately 484,000 hectares of unalienated Crown land near the Canteen Creek community. Canteen Creek is known locally as Owatilla and lies about 270 kilometres southeast of Tennant Creek in the Barkly region of the Northern Territory. The Albanese Labor government has introduced this bill to support the implementation of the Canteen Creek Area Indigenous Land Use Agreement, which was entered into by the Northern Territory and the Central Land Council in 2020. An Indigenous Land Use Agreement, or an ILUA, for those that don't work in this area of law, is a voluntary agreement between native title parties and other peoples or bodies about the use and management of areas of land or waters. It's actually very common, not uncommon, particularly in the mining industry. In fact, when I worked back in that area, there was even ILUAs that covered all of Queensland for certain agreements. So this ILUA resolves the native title rights and interests over all the land within the Canteen Creek Township boundary. In the case of the Canteen Creek area, this bill will finalise the Wakaya Alawara land claim under the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976, also known as the Land Rights Act. The people of the Wakaya and Aliwara and I do apologise for my pronunciation if they're off. These language groups have a strong connection with this land, which is linked with emu and many other dreamings. They've been waiting for decades for their land claim to be finalised, with land claims beginning in 1980 and 1990. The Land Rights Act is a federal law that is unique to the Northern Territory, a piece of legislation that was drafted by the Whitlam government and introduced to Parliament in October 1975, and then this largely unchanged legislation was subsequently passed by the Fraser government in 1976 to their, I particularly praise Malcolm Fraser for his work with First Nations people. This was the first legislation in the country to enable First Nations people to claim land rights for country, as in the part of Australia that they belong to, where traditional ownership could be proven. At its centre is a recognition of First Nations' spiritual and cultural affiliation with the land. It's a concept touched on by in song, I suppose, with the idea of, as a property lawyer, as a conveyancing lawyer, my idea was to get people to own land, whereas for some First Nations peoples, it's the concept of belonging to the land. In Queensland, we do have something not a little bit dissimilar, the deed of grant in trust lands or dogget lands, but the background there is a little bit more problematic because dogget lands were often a dumping ground for various First Nations people, where they were removed from country and then dumped in one area, often a mission. So dogget land is slightly different. But the Land Rights Act has enshrined Aboriginal land as private property, which its traditional owners hold collectively through a unique form of freehold title. The land cannot be sold or mortgaged. The former conveyancing lawyer in me loves this stuff, but obviously it's not everyone's cup of tea. The Land Rights Act also established 4 land councils, including the Central Land Council, and the Central Land Council is responsible for the southern half of the Northern Territory. Under the Act, the Central Land Council consults traditional Aboriginal landowners and other Aboriginal people with an interest in Aboriginal land about proposals for the use of that land and assists with land claims and management. It also supervises and assists Aboriginal land trusts, assists with the economic development of land and promotes community development, administers permits to visit Aboriginal land and protects Aboriginal culture and sacred sites. And I know that there is much work taking place in terms of the green energy transition, in terms of returns to traditional owners that can come by having wind farms and solar and the like, solar panels on land that export electricity. With the passing of this bill, the Wakaya Alawari land will be granted as Aboriginal land to an Aboriginal land trust. The land trust will hold inalienable freehold title for the benefit of the traditional First Nations owners and other First Nations people who have an interest in the land. This bill is supported by stakeholders, having been through the Illawarra execution process with the Central Land Council. This includes all reasonable efforts to identify impacted people and a time frame for objections to be raised. The only impacts will be minor, as the Aboriginal Land Trust will be required to comply with the provisions of the Land Rights Act. It's also important to consider this bill in regards to closing the gap framework. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap includes 19 aims that have an impact on the life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Outcome number 15 is that people maintain a distinctive cultural, spiritual, physical and economic relationship with their land and waters. So even if you're not living in that area, you still are able to maintain some of those other aspects that, as outlined in number 15 of the Closing the Gap targets. The corresponding target is set for 2030 and it's twofold. Firstly, it aims for a 15% increase in Australian land mass that is subject to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's legal rights or interests. Secondly, it aims for a 15% increase in areas covered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's legal rights or interests in the sea. According to the Productivity Commission, as at the 30th of June 23, more than 4.2 million square kilometres of the landmass of Australia and over 113,000 square kilometres of the sea country of Australia were subject to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's rights or interests. The Productivity Commission notes that the targets are on track to being met, and this bill is another important step in this journey. With land certainty, land tenure certainty, comes economic opportunity. So this bill affirms that the Albanese Labor government is committed to finalising land claims in the Northern Territory under the Land Rights Act. Setting of land rights matters enable traditional owners to maintain their distinctive cultural, spiritual, physical and economic relationship to the land, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I wish to speak in relation to the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Amendment Scheduling Bill 2024. And the effect of the bill would be to add an area of vacant Crown land near the Aboriginal community of Canteen Creek to Part 4 of Schedule 1 of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976. And as we've just heard, this bill resolves the Wakaya Alawari land rights claim and would allow the land to be able to be granted to an Aboriginal land trust as inalienable Aboriginal freehold land. Now, in order for this agreement to be completed, the Commonwealth Parliament must directly amend the Land Rights Act. Deputy Speaker, the initial agreement was between the Central Land Council and the Labor Northern Territory Government. Following the recent election in the Northern Territory, we have consulted with the new CLP government in relation to the proposal, and the government is supportive of this bill being passed. The Northern Territory government has advised that if passed, the bill will not have any impact on pastoral interests. Further, it poses no issue to mining or energy interests. We recognise this bill will provide certainty to both the Northern Territory government and the township. In this regard, we note that housing and commercial development projects often require land lease terms which are significant in length in order for the project to proceed. If this bill is successful, which we believe it will be, it will allow for this kind of development and investment in the region. Deputy Speaker, despite the fact that there are benefits to this bill, we are concerned that the Albanese government refused to refer this bill to a committee for further examination. When the bill was introduced in the Senate, the Coalition requested that it be referred to the Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee. The Albanese government's refusal to refer this bill to the committee was, in our opinion, a wasted opportunity. The reality is the Land Rights Act, which is amended by this bill, has been in operation now for nearly 50 years and is in need of review and revision. This bill provided a timely opportunity to examine whether the Land Rights Act remains fit for purpose. It provided an opportunity to consider whether it still serves in the interests of Indigenous Australians to the extent most possible, or whether it could be more effective. Deputy Speaker, the Land Rights Act provides a unique opportunity for Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory. It should be a springboard for wealth, health and improved quality of life. However, the reality is that Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory are not the most advantaged in the country, far from it. In fact, some Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory are our most disadvantaged, most marginalised and most vulnerable. This is a point the Coalition often raises when addressing Indigenous disadvantage in this place, that our focus needs to be where the gap is in fact the greatest. We know that 3% of the Australian population is Indigenous, but it is only around 20% of that total which is actually marginalised. But the situation in the Northern Territory is particularly bad. The 2024 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Performance Framework reveals that Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory experience the greatest area-level disadvantage compared with other jurisdictions around Australia. The disparity is concerning given the opportunity that the Land Rights Act provides for this to not be the case. It demonstrates that things are not working the way they should be for our most vulnerable and marginalised Indigenous Australians. And this is just one reason why revisiting the operation of the Land Rights Act would have been beneficial in this case. An examination of the Land Rights Act would also have been important because of its role in governing Northern Territory land councils. We believe the operation of land councils is, in large part, causing traditional owners in the Northern Territory to be land rich but dirt poor. The councils often make it functionally impossible for land to be utilised for economic development. We are seeing, Deputy Speaker, lease processing times of up to 666 days in some land councils, which is simply unacceptable. However, not all land councils have these problems, therefore we know it's possible for things to be better if the legislation was actually reviewed. Further, we believe that some of the larger Northern Territory land councils are hindering opportunity in the community. Despite the Territory having comparable wealth due to its resources, the Northern Territory only sees a fraction of the mining and energy projects that a place like Western Australia has. The Northern Territory should look more like Western Australia than the ACT due to our environments and resources. It simply isn't the case in the Territory at the moment. Again, this is why the reference of this bill to a committee would have been a beneficial step. Deputy Speaker, if we want to empower Indigenous Australians to achieve economic independence and to stand on their own 2 feet, we need to be willing to examine the existing structures like the land councils.
And if those structures aren't able to be effective and efficient, they shouldn't exist. But the knee-jerk type responses which we see time and again from the Albanese Labor government that simply create more layers of government just aren't going to cut it. So as some of the most powerful and important decision-making bodies in the Northern Territory, this bill could have ensured the land councils were examined if it in fact had gone to a committee for review. The truth is, opportunity abounds in the Northern Territory, and that opportunity should be used and could be used to improve the situation of the most marginalised Indigenous Australians in the Northern Territory who live in highly disadvantaged areas at a greater rate than those in other parts of the country. But the Albanese government shut the chance of that down when it refused to refer this bill to a committee. Therefore, Deputy Speaker, while the Coalition does support this motion, we feel it's necessary to have highlighted these points about the need for the Land Rights Act to be revisited as a matter of urgency for the sake of our most marginalised Indigenous Australians. I thank the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And in summing up this debate, I want to thank members for their contributions on the proposed Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Amendment Scheduling Bill 2024. As has been highlighted, this bill adds an area of land to Schedule 1 of the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976, the Land Rights Act. This enables the grant of land to an Aboriginal land trust and finalisation of the Wakaya Aliwara repeat land claim. The land in question comprises approximately 484,000 hectares near Canteen Creek community in the Barkly region of the Northern Territory. It's approximately 275 kilometres south-east of Tennant Creek. I just want to acknowledge the contributions of the member for Gippsland, who noted that this does provide certainty to the Northern Territory Government, and they have provided their support. I also want to thank members of the Coalition for their support on this bill, and to note, as the member for Gippsland just did in his words, that this does bring both economic and social benefits to the communities affected. It also is consistent with our commitments that have been endorsed in this place to closing the gap, and this is consistent with our commitment and our obligations under that partnership. I want to thank my friend the member for Moreton for his contribution, noting this is about ownership and control. I agree it was a brilliant contribution from the member for Moreton because he talked also about recognising history, and this bill is about recognising history that has been here long before any of us came into this place, long before, and talked about the importance of the traditional owners recognising that while this is about them having custody of that land, that they see themselves as belonging to the land. And again, I thank him for his note of what he talked about when it came to the extensive consultation and the benefits for community development when it comes to what this bill will enable. The government remains committed to progressing unresolved land claims in the Northern Territory. It's all part of our determination to increase First Nations land rights and interests in land and sea and country when it comes to meeting the National Partnership Agreement on closing the gap. This recognises the many social, economic and cultural benefits which can only be achieved from land ownership and continuing connection to country. I acknowledge that for the traditional owners, this land has significant emu dreaming associations and many other dreamings. I'd like to thank the traditional owners, the Central Land Council, thank the Northern Territory Government for their work to finalise the Indigenous Land Use Agreement which supports this bill. This bill paves the way for finalisation of the long-standing Aboriginal land claim. I commend the bill to the Chamber.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, and I call the clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to amend the Aboriginal Land Rights Northern Territory Act 1976 and for related purposes.
If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I will put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. And I call the clerk.
Committee and delegation business. Order of the day number 1. Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Resumption of debate on the motion to take note of the report.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I am pleased to be speaking on this report by the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Drowning in Waste, Plastic Pollution in Australia's Oceans and Waterways. This is an important report, and I thank each member of the Standing Committee for the work on an issue that is having a devastating impact in Australia's oceans and waterways. I particularly want to thank the Chair of the Standing Committee, the member for Macon, for his work. This issue is particularly acute in my community of Dunkley, which sits along Port Phillip Bay and bears the full brunt of plastic pollution after storms or heavy rainfall. I walk down the beach after a storm and you are greeted by rubbish. Plastic bits and pieces, bottle tops, single-use plastic, cups and bottles, thongs, toys, debris in all shapes and sizes. I take a rubbish bag with me to help clean up the mess. We also have creeks and other waterways like Sweetwater Creek in Frankston South and Patterson River feeding into Patterson Lakes. These precious waterways also get clogged with plastic after heavy rainfall. The committee, in its Drowning in Waste, Plastic Pollution in Australia's Oceans and Waterways report, made 22 recommendations aimed at trying to create incentives for newly produced plastic to contain recycled materials, strengthening Australia's plastic management framework, and also strengthen the management of plastic that already exists in the environment. To me, these are important, critical measures that must be implemented to reduce the harm caused by plastics, because the harm associated with plastics is undeniable, whether it be to humans, animals, marine life, or to our beautiful natural environment. As the report points out, microfibres and microplastics are already found in our food and water, containing harmful chemicals and toxins that are detrimental to human health. Just recently, I watched a report on the ABC which made the connection between leaching from plastic packaging and increasing levels of infertility in men and women. I would like to acknowledge the work of the Minderoo Foundation in collaboration with the Joanna Briggs Institute at the University of Adelaide, who undertook the Umbrella Review, a world-leading study. The Plastic Health Umbrella Review specifically looked at some of the most commonly used plastics, chemicals that we know humans are exposed to. The Umbrella Review found that there is consistent and irrefutable evidence that plastic chemicals in every class examine harm human health across the entire human life cycle. There is much more research to be done in this space, as we as a society have significant gaps in knowledge on this issue. There are some really good and simple recommendations included in the Drowning in Waste report which can be implemented relatively easily. Simple things like Recommendation 9 to standardise and simplify plastic packaging and recyclability labelling to make it easier for consumers to recycle effectively. Greenwashing is legitimate, which requires more oversight. Creating a uniform system of recyclability labelling would help solve this. Recommendation 8 is another one recommending the harmonising and expanding state and territory container deposit schemes. In Victoria, we only received a container deposit scheme a little over a year ago. But I know that many states and territories have been running their own container deposit schemes for many years. Creating uniformity in these schemes and expanding it to include milk, juice, wine and spirit bottles would go a long way to reducing plastics entering landfill or our natural environment. Governments must take leadership on schemes like this where the private sector fails. Situations like Soft Plastics Recycler RedCycle were in November 2022 suspended their soft plastics collection program due to their recycling partners temporarily stopping accepting processing of soft plastics. The suspension of RedCycle program removed the only established and widespread recycling pathway for consumers and created significant concerns about existing stockpiles and how consumers can recycle soft plastics. In response, the Soft Plastics Task Force was established, and I look forward to its recommendations and outcomes. There is a clear need for an effective program which is uniform across the country and led by the Australian government. As the committee noted in its report, one of the big disappointments is the Australia's National Plastics Plan is not fit for purpose. It's disconnected and just doesn't have the appropriate goals required for Australia to reduce plastic pollution meaningfully. Australia needs an updated National Plastics Plan. Responsibility for plastics must be shifted back onto plastic manufacturers because 1.84 billion single-use cups are being wasted by every Australian each year, contributing to health, litter, landfill and climate change. And according to the Department of Climate Change and Energy, Environment and Water, 130,000 tonnes of plastics leak into the marine environment in Australia every year. Globally, it's estimated that over 12 million tonnes of plastic leaks into the oceans every year. And according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, based on current trends, there will be more plastic than fish by weight in the oceans by 2050. I recently met with Boomerang Alliance, who has been shining the light on the impact of the use of plastic packaging, which in Australia is excessive, wasteful and dangerous to the environment, our wildlife and humans. They have developed a stewardship model packaging framework, including guidelines for a best practice scheme to inform the proposed Commonwealth scheme. The scheme includes guidelines and principles for packaging and circular economy arrangements. The framework is built on the premise that business producing or selling packaging have a responsibility beyond the design and use of their packaging to contribute towards it being collected, reused, recycled and composted. In Dunkley, we have many passionate locals working hard to address the impacts such as plastic-free places. Plastic-free places is supporting local businesses and organisations to adopt plastic-free practices. For example, carrying a reusable water bottle and taking your own cup for a takeaway coffee. It is small things like these that all of us can do to take action and make change. Thanks to these local organisations, staff and dedicated volunteers from Dunkley and beyond that I have met with, the Boomerang Alliance, Plastic Free Places, Beach Patrol Frankston and the South East Climate Change Alliance. Your work is immeasurable. We are actively aware there is more we need to do as a government to reduce our reliance on single-use plastics, mainly derived from fossil fuels, whilst avoiding the emissions and waste materials plastic produces. We know there is more to do and are working to change legislation to ensure targets are mandatory, not voluntary, so they are adopted and achieved. I want to finish on some words from the member for Macon, who said very aptly in his media release, without urgent action, plastic waste will increase and continue to negatively impact our oceans and waterways and humans. Australia needs to act now to protect its natural environment for future generations.
The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate is made in order of the day for a later hour this day. And I call the clerk.
Committee and delegation business, order of the day number 2, Standing Committee on Employment, Education and Training, resumption of debate on the motion that the House take note of the report.
The question is that the document be noted and I call the member for Holt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Generative AI has experienced extraordinary growth in the recent years. From its origins in the 2010s as a tool for generating simple chat responses, it has now evolved into a sophisticated technology capable of producing videos, images, and long forms of essays. Today, Gen AI is being used extensively in workplaces, educational institutions, and even by some within this very building. This technology is not a trend. It is reshaping the way we work, learn, and interact. It is rapidly becoming embedded in workplaces, education systems, and society at large. As a nation, it is crucial that we stay ahead of this technological curve. Our government must establish clear regulations, guidelines, and expectations to govern its use responsibly. This will safeguard Australians and ensure that we fully harness the potential of Gen AI to enrich our society. Equally important is preparing students to engage with this technology safely and effectively. Educators must be equipped with the tools, knowledge, and training to teach AI literacy meaningfully. Integrating AI into classrooms should enhance learning while preserving the critical thinking and creativity that underpin a quality education. Deputy Speaker, the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Employment, Education and Training recently concluded its inquiry into the use of generative artificial intelligence in the Australian education system. This inquiry began in May 2023, involved 15 public hearings across Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney and online. It received over 100 submissions from stakeholders including state governments, universities, professional associations, trade unions, experts and private individuals. The committee's work resulted in the report Study Buddy or Influencer, which outlines 25 recommendations. These recommendations address the risk, opportunities and best practices with Gen AI in education, offering a clear roadmap for its responsible integration into our schools. Deputy Speaker, one of the report's key recommendations is for the Australian Government, in collaboration with state and territory governments, to develop and fund a comprehensive implementation plan. This plan would deliver training for teachers, support staff, students, parents and policymakers to use Gen AI effectively. Educators need professional development through virtual and in-person training modules to ensure they can integrate AI into classrooms responsibly. The report also highlights significant risk associated with Gen AI. Data protection is one of the most pressing concerns. Many AI tools collect and store the information entered into them and harvest data from across the internet. This raises serious privacy issues, especially for students who may unknowingly share personal information that becomes public and is owned by developers. Another critical risk is the growing digital divide. Low socioeconomic students who may lack access to computers or school-provided laptops are at a significant disadvantage compared to their wealthier inner-city counterparts. If we are committed to equity in education, bridging this divide is essential. All students must have access to the necessary technology as well as the training and support to use it effectively. Deputy Speaker, Australia is not alone in addressing these challenges. Countries such as the EU, Canada and the US are grappling with similar issues. Engaging with our international partners will allow us to develop consistent guidelines to share the best practices. By working together, we can create a global framework that supports the ethical and effective use of Gen AI in education. Gen AI holds immense potential to enhance education, but it must be approached with foresight and care. The Study Buddy or Influencer report provides Australia with an opportunity to lead the way in integrating this technology into schools to benefit all students, regardless of their backgrounds. I would like to extend my thanks to the Chair, the Member for Bendigo, Lisa Chesters MP, for her leadership throughout this inquiry, and to the Committee Secretariat for their work in producing this report. I thank the House.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Flinders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Employment, Education and Training's inquiry into the use of generative artificial intelligence in the Australian education system and its fine report, Study Buddy or Influencer, released last August. And I echo the comments of the member for Holt for our exemplary leadership by our chair and the enthusiasm and intelligent contribution of our colleagues and indeed the Secretariat. I do start, though, by thanking the Minister for Education, the member for Blaxland, for referring this essential question to the committee after some overly enthusiastic advocacy from a nameless coalition member of the committee who will not be named in this place. When it comes to the future of our education system and the impact generative AI will have on it, we need to be bold, imaginative and optimistic. That is not where I started in this inquiry and is certainly not where I ended. 2 years ago, I stood in the main chamber and delivered my first speech, and I feared a demise in education standards as devices dislodged books in our education system and increased the incidence of concentration difficulties, impulsivity, sleep disturbance and poor language development. When in November 2022, ChatGPT was released to the global market, I feared my most pessimistic predictions were all too proximate. But April of last year, in 2023, I went to Europe and met with the leading public policy analysts in this space, Tia Luquola and indeed Andreas Schleicher from the OECD. And later that year in Belgium, I met with the authors of the EU's Digital Services Act and those who were holding the pen on the EU's generative AI laws. I met with organisations whose job it was to equip and upscale the European teaching workforce to deal with technology and generative AI and specifically large language models. So my fear for falling education standards was replaced by excitement for what it might mean in the Australian classroom. Our children are not performing well. Look at our PISA results. Between 2003 and 2022, Australia's mean performance has decreased by 37 points, which is almost 10%, and we now have the most disrupted classrooms in the world. Equally, our teaching profession is in crisis. We need thousands more to come into the profession, and those who are in, we need them to stay. Quite a number who go into teaching degrees these days have barely passed their own Year 12 finishing certificate. For reasons we all struggle to understand, teaching remains a poorly regarded profession in Australia, despite the enormous impact it has on every single one of us, and the sensible investment in teacher attraction innovations like Teach for Australia, whose graduates are making a great impact across the country, especially in the Western Port Secondary College in my electorate. There would not be a person in this place who was unable to identify a teacher who made it possible for them to stand here today. In my case, that teacher was Mr. Andrew Barnett. He taught me Australian history and economics, and he is the reason I stand here today. And without a doubt, everyone here across the Parliament could name that teacher that changed their life in a millisecond. And yet by next year, it is estimated that Australia will be short at least 4,000 secondary teachers. As this inquiry showed, generative AI gives us an ability to reimagine the education model from the bottom up. In an opinion piece that I wrote for the Financial Review a year ago, I imagined a world in which a hologram would appear in the classroom. It might be a hologram of Oscar Wilde, or it might be Shakespeare, it might be George Orwell. But it would be imbued with the wisdom, writings, research and imagery of the time and be able to converse with school children in a language they understand, as though the bard was really there. At the time, even I felt like I was describing a wonderland, except that a few months later, Loughborough University in the UK did exactly that. It brought into a lecture hall a global expert from somewhere in the United States through proto-haloportation technology to interact with students as though the lecturer was not thousands of kilometres away. Recently, I was listening, as I do almost every night, we are sad people in these places, to podcasts about technology and how it was changing our lives. And on Saturday night, I listened to an episode of Your Undivided Attention, probably the best podcast for analysing tech for good, tech for bad and tech for terrible, as I like to think of it. In it, psychologist Esther Perel described how someone had built a chatbot of her. Frustrated that he had been unable to secure a consultation appointment with her directly, he sat down and invented a large language model filled with all of her words, her teachings, her podcasts and interviews, and any other material he could find. AI Esther didn't have trouble setting up an appointment. In Perel's own words, AI Esther fundamentally helped him, and the advice and consultation was illuminating and gave him tremendous peace. He did not need the real thing anymore. The bot had just enough wisdom to help get him through a difficult time. Now, I'm absolutely not recommending this model for psychology, not one bit. I'm a big fan of all the messiness of human relations and the need for other human relations to help us make sense of them. But I'm not so pure when it comes to teaching, and we must recognise that this model has the potential for teaching our children, at least in part, at least the basics. You see, a large language model teacher designed for each particular child can move at the pace of that child, understand the proclivities of that child, encourage or cajole the child in a way that will actually be effective and get them back to the learning table, because these devices already know our children better than we do. In this way, generative AI and EdTech can be a huge and beneficial resource for our schooling system. But I hasten to add most forcefully, education cannot and must not just be about devices. Education must remain both a social and human activity, and it must always be thus if we are to equip young people to make a contribution to this world. The EdTech devices should be allowed to do what they can do better, or what they can do in an environment where we just don't have the adequate skilled teacher workforce that we need. But we must preserve the human side with as much, if not more, expertise. Throughout the hearings of this inquiry, I asked a number of our witnesses, could you just tell me what human attributes you think we're still going to need in society in 5, 10 or 15 years' time? It's a question I asked of my European interlocutors as well. Will critical thinking still be important? Will grammar and mathematics still be important? Will young people need to know geography? Will people need to know how to speak another language? Because, of course, generative AI could wipe out these skills in less than a generation, in the same way that ubiquitous smartphones has affected younger people's ability to read an analogue clock or to read a map. Throughout this inquiry, I learned that this notion has a discrete term in the context of generative AI. It's called cognitive offloading, meaning just parking some of those skills, tasks or knowledge that we simply don't need anymore until we do. I fear that without some degree of vigilance, cognitive offloading will take with it some of our creativity, our innovation, our resilience, our lateral thinking, and most concerningly, our wisdom. In this country at this point, most of the public policy settings and alterations we are implementing regarding generative AI are being done as the AI plane flies through the sky. But we're approaching it as we would any other education tool, like it's the calculator or the computer or the compass. But it is like none of those. Generative AI will change every aspect of the workforce. It will change every aspect of our learning journey, as well as the skill sets we need at the end of it. Half of our current jobs will lose their tasks to large language models. The question is whether we recognise that in time and whether we guide generative AI, especially in education, for good. One of the recommendations of this report was to maintain Australia's competitive edge in this domain. Attending the TEXA conference last year, I learnt that Australia had actually benefited enormously from the fact that ChatGPT was invented in November 22, giving our university sector time to prepare for the academic year. That is why in recommendation 25 of this Study Buddy or Influencer report, the committee recommends that the Australian Government establish a Centre for Digital Education Excellence modelled on the existing CRC centres, which would act as a thought leader in relation to both the use and development of generative AI in school and university settings. I note that that recommendation was equally picked up and reiterated in a further recommendation 3 of the Coalition members' additional comments to the Joint Select Committee on Social Media and Australian Society's final report issued last week. I thank the remarkable work of Jason Lodge at the University of Queensland and Danny Liu of the University of Sydney, who are nothing short of visionaries in this space. We need to support and sustain not just their imagination, but their practical exploration of what is possible within the Australian education system to use this technology, this intervention and this revolution for our national benefit. There are many models to ensure that we can catch up such thought leadership, but this report suggests we need to look at them with haste to make sure Australian minds shape the development and adoption of best practice in generative AI in the Australian education system. This report, like the social media report released last week, provides a pathway to ensure Australia has a clear plan for promoting tech for good, managing tech for bad, and eliminating tech for terrible.
The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate is made in order of the day for a later hour this day, and I call the clerk.
Committee and Delegation Business, Order of the Day number 3, Standing Committee on Economics, motion, a resumption of debate on the motion that the House take note of the report.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm going to read a quote, 2 paragraphs. Australia is a country of fires, floods, cyclones and other extreme weather events. Recent natural disasters have revealed a number of gaps in consumer protection when it comes to general insurance. The mass lodgement of business, home and contents insurance gaps in the wake of multiple natural disasters that have hit Australia in recent years showed up these consumer protection gaps in stark detail. Claimants had nowhere to turn and no means of redress when they were unable to have their insurance claims resolved in a timely manner. Victims of extreme weather events all over Australia faced unacceptable delays in the assessment of their claims, misunderstandings about the scope and extent of their policies, a lack of information or communication from insurers, discrepancies or inaccuracies in damage assessments or third-party expert reports, and token efforts at dispute resolution. Those who tried to assert their rights in the labyrinth of the claims process found themselves on the wrong side of a power imbalance. Deputy Speaker, those words do not come from the Flood Failure to Future Fairness report so ably chaired by the member for Fraser, Dr Daniel Molino, in the House of Representatives Committee on Economics. Those words come from a report on the now defunct House of Representatives Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs, chaired by the member for Moreton 12 years ago, arising out of the natural disasters in North Queensland and across the country, and particularly in South East Queensland. He chaired that committee. I was on that committee. Those words 12 years ago could have been included in the report done by the House of Representatives Committee on Economics. Not enough has changed. As Dr Daniel Molino said, the member for Fraser, in his media release when tabling this report, too many cases were badly mishandled. Inconsistent decision-making meant neighbours receiving different outcomes after the same event. Long delays caused emotional, mental health and financial strain. More than 2 years on, many people still can't get into their homes. Initial offers were too low, which was especially problematic for cash settlements. The member for Fraser and the member for Moreton were saying almost the same words 12 years apart. 2 separate parliamentary committees. The insurance industry in this country should get a handle of itself and have a good hard look at itself. The Insurance Council of Australia, in their submission to this inquiry, blamed the consumers for living close to areas where there could be natural disasters, quoting former Governor Lachlan Macquarie about the fact that these people had themselves to blame. That's the attitude of the Insurance Council of Australia initially when this inquiry was held. Fortunately, the insurance companies moved, and statements of contrition and regret continued to operate during the submissions and the public hearings of this inquiry. But it doesn't matter where this inquiry moved, whether in New South Wales or in South East Queensland or in Cairns and Townsville, which I recall vividly, the insurance industry failed monumentally with the natural disasters that took place and have not learnt enough in the 12 years between these 2 parliamentary reports. Whether it's government response, community response or insurance company response to floods and natural disasters, the response needs to be swift, direct and generous, and that's what the Australian public expects. This is a comprehensive report, and the member for Fraser did a brilliant job in relation to this report. I thank the Secretariat for what they've done, and the members of the committee who worked in a very bipartisan way, indeed a tripartisan way, because there was one independent member on the committee. In 2022, floods devastated communities across Australia. New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania and my home state of Queensland. More than 300,000 claims being lodged, more than any other natural disaster in Australia's history. But the insurance industry kept on saying this was unprecedented. They're actually in the business of insurance and have been since colonial times in Australia. So don't give us that. It's a bit like complaining if you're playing football and say, I'm worried about getting tackled or having been penalised or losing a game. If you're going to play the game, if you're going to be in the business of insurance, you've got to do better and you've got to look after your consumers better. You know, policyholders need to be treated better. Pooling mechanisms need to be strengthened. Preparation needs to be done better. Cash payments were too low and the idea was get the money out and we won't have anything more to do with it. People were treated poorly. The number of cases that we heard during the inquiry of insurers denying claims, then denying the internal dispute resolution process, and then the case going to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, and the insurers losing at that authority at AVCA level. Their success rate at AVCA level was less than 20%. If you're a football coach and you lose more than 80% of the time, you're going to lose your job. The insurance industry was losing more than 80% of the time in the internal procedure, which was being manifest into the external procedure. You're losing at AVCA level more than 80% of the time. There's a problem internally in your dispute resolution process. They didn't prepare well enough in any way at all. They kept on admitting that during the course of the process. There are a number of recommendations, about 86 recommendations. They need to be adopted. Recommendations in terms of the general industry code of practice. It needs to be strengthened as a matter of priority. It needs to be registered with ASIC's approval. And further, the code needs to be contractually enforceable in relation to the insurance responsibility. In addition to that, there should be guidance given by insurers to consumers at emergency hubs. Too often insurance companies didn't bother turning up to these community hubs where there's natural disasters. Too often they didn't answer the phone. Too often they didn't get back to their policyholders. Too often the so-called meaningful timelines were just ignored by insurance companies. The supercilious and arrogant way the insurance companies dealt with so many of their customers and claimants was there for all to see in submission after submission and hearing after hearing. Now, we've got to do better at a federal government level too and a state government level. Deloitte Access Economics, after the 2011 floods, I remember did a report that said if we spent about $250 million on insurance, on preparation, on resilience and flood mitigation, we could save ourselves about $12.5 billion to the taxpayer, because we know, and in 2014 the Productivity Commission found that 97% of natural disaster fundings from Australian government, the states and territories and local governments go after the natural disasters, and only 3% are invested in mitigation and resilience. Now, we've committed $200 million in our disaster ready fund, and we should be committing that or more. It was oversubscribed on the 2 occasions that people made applications for that funding. I got some in my electorate, and I'm deeply grateful. There's some that I wished I'd got as well, in terms of community hubs at Mount Crosby for a start, in Corona Downs area. There's an opportunity in the DRF process to substantially reduce the risks of flooding for communities exposed to high levels of risk, and I can see the benefit in flood mitigation and roads up in Toogoolawah in my electorate, in the Somerset, but also in Ipswich showgrounds. The Resilient Homes program that was so successful in South East Queensland needs to be rolled out nationally. It's one of the recommendations of this inquiry. So we can do more. That program was a one-off for South East Queensland. New South Wales had a similar one. We need to do this on a regular basis, a whole of government level, That's something that should be there, available pool to retrofit and to improve and raise homes, to make sure that homes are more resilient, whether it's in Ipswich, in my electorate at Trumpurst Street, East Ipswich, or indeed in Goodna, in Ipswich. We've seen the benefit of the Resilient Homes program. There are many recommendations here. I'm urging the government to pick them up and the insurance companies to do better.
The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate is made an order of the day for a later hour this day. And I call the clerk.
Committee and Delegation Business, Order of the Day number 4, resumption of debate on the report of the Standing Committee on Health, Aged Care and Sport.
The question is that the document be noted. I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. 1 in 20 Australians, that's 1.5 million people, lives with diabetes. It's a number which continues to increase. The nation faces a diabetes epidemic. Type 2 diabetes is by far the most common form. In Australia, it's much more likely to affect people of lower socioeconomic standing, those people who have less access to clean water and to affordable fresh food, who have less time and space for regular physical activity and often less access to health care. First Nations people have a frighteningly high incidence of diabetes type 2. They develop it at a younger age, and their progression to potentially life-threatening complications is extraordinarily rapid. Diabetes is the leading contributor to the gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In fact, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are nearly 5 times more likely to be hospitalised for diabetes-related complications. Diabetes is the leading cause of death for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. The reasons for this are complex. They include both genetic predisposition and a raft of socio-economic factors. Those factors include the urgent need for action on diet. All Australians eat too many ultra-processed foods and too many foods with added sugar and hidden chemicals. Unhealthy foods represent a third of Australian children's diets. 1 in 4 is overweight or obese. For too long, obesity and type 2 diabetes have been understood in this country as conditions which are caused by personal choices. But our committee's findings found that it's a lot more complex than that. 41% of the total energy intake of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is derived from what we would usually call discretionary foods and drinks, items which are high in saturated fat, in salt and in sugar. This is not always an issue of choice. The Health Committee visited rural communities, and it was tragic to see in this day and age in this country that tap water was unsafe and undrinkable, and that bottled water cost more than Coke. We went to a community in which the only vegetable in the shop was potatoes, and they were $11 a kilogram, in which the only fruit that was available was frozen. All of those foodstuffs cost 2 or 3 times what they would in a capital city. Parents have to feed their kids. They'll do what they have to keep their kids happy. It's up to all of us to ensure that all Australians have access to affordable, healthy food choices and safe water. It's also an issue for people in the capital cities, though, as well. Most Australians don't understand how much sugar is added to our food. The regulation of food manufacturers in this country is poor, whether we're talking about codes for infant formulas or health star ratings for other foods. Their labelling is remarkably misleading and makes it impossible for parents. 43% of the foods for infants and toddlers in our supermarkets exceed the recommended limits for sugar, often because they contain processed fruit sugars in the form of fruit juices or pastes or purees. Many breast milk substitutes, or what is being marketed to young mums as toddler milks, are effectively just sugary drinks. Our labelling codes are voluntary, and only 41% of products display health star ratings. Manufacturers of healthy products use those health star ratings as a marketing tool, and those that don't market healthy foods just don't put a health star rating on the packaging. The star system is also problematic, though, because it doesn't distinguish between natural sugars and artificial sweeteners. It gives higher ratings to ultra-processed foods and lower ratings to whole foods. We urgently need a mandatory food labelling scheme which provides accurate and clear health information to consumers when they buy food for themselves and for their families. Australians also deserve access to universal quality health care. People living with diabetes in this country often have to contend with very high prices and long waiting times when they're trying to access the vital medical supports which can help them with their insulin management and their weight management. So the Health Committee has called on the government to fund longer MBS consultations, to support expanded telehealth services and to broaden case coordination models for people with diabetes and obesity. We have to change our model of care in the face of the increasing prevalence of complex and chronic diseases in an ageing Australian population. We also recommended to the government that we subsidise access to evidence-based pharmaceuticals, monitoring devices and bariatric surgeries for people who are living with diabetes and obesity. GLP-1 receptor agonists and similar medications are game changers for Indigenous persons and young adolescents with type 2 diabetes. It is terrifying to see the number of adolescents with type 2 diabetes in some communities, particularly Indigenous communities. When I was a paediatrician, there was no such thing. Now it's becoming a really, really common problem, and it's going to affect the next generation in a way which is going to bite home very significantly in decades to come. GLP-1 receptor agonists facilitate rapid weight loss, and they improve diabetes control. They really have a significant effect on long-term complications like renal failure, diabetic neuropathy, premature heart disease and peripheral vascular disease, but they also have significant side effects, and their cost is extremely challenging. We have a healthcare system which is already struggling to deal with approvals processes and with the cost of new and emerging medications and technologies.
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. Proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions.
the chair has actually resumed for another few minutes. We can
The
do
bell's
that.
going to ring in a minute, so I'll try and get as much as I can.
Okay.
So,
Oh, well,
okay. Because this is enough twos for quorum.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so before we begin in continuation with the member for Coorong, there was an error before where you didn't ask for leave to, as you've already spoken on this, so if you can just ask if leave to speak on this, that'll be fine.
I ask leave of the chamber to speak again on this.
Is leave granted? Okay. Member for Coorong, continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We have to take action to prevent increasing intergenerational morbidity associated with diabetes. It is not overstating the case to say that the potential impact of this issue in the decades to come on population health, but also on our economy, is terrifying. We do not plan well enough for long-term, large-scale healthcare provision in this country. The lack of availability of bariatric surgery outside the private hospital system is a case in point. It was a privilege to be a member of the parliamentary committee which investigated diabetes in Australia. But our efforts will be wasted if the government does not act on the committee's findings. Far too many government committee reports gather dust on shelves. That's not just a waste of the committee's time and effort and money. It's not just an insult to the hundreds of people who gave their time and the benefit of their experience in the undertaking of this committee. It's also the opportunity cost of not taking action on what is an emerging public health emergency in this country. We need to take action in the simplest and most fundamental of ways. We need to improve regulation of the food and drinks industry in this country, and we need to improve the provision of healthcare for complex and chronic diseases. If we do not, we will all bear the cost and the loss associated with the plague that the emerging diabetes epidemic represents.
Okay. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate is made an order of the day for the next sitting. The Fed chamber is now suspended until 4 p.m.